The headlines exploded. Chaos in the South China Sea. The world was jolted awake by a story that would dominate every screen and conversation for days to come. Chinese ship rams Filipino boat. Fishermen missing. The news spread like wildfire, igniting fear and outrage across the globe. On January 5, 2026, what began as a routine fishing trip west of the Philippines suddenly spiraled into an international crisis, drawing the eyes of the world to a volatile flashpoint. The world watched in shock as reports poured in, each update more alarming than the last. The Maria Clara, a small Filipino fishing boat, was suddenly and violently rammed by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, shattering the calm of the open sea. This was no accident. It was a deliberate act in one of the world's most contested and dangerous waters, where tensions simmer just below the surface. The Filipino crew, fishing in their own exclusive economic zone, faced a steel giant bearing down on them, their livelihoods and lives suddenly at risk. The Chinese ship, white with a bold red stripe, closed in with menacing intent, its size and power overwhelming the tiny fishing boat. The fishermen stood their ground, refusing to abandon their waters. The confrontation escalated rapidly, with adrenaline and fear surging through the crew. The Chinese vessel circled, blared its horn, and then rammed the Maria Clara, sending shockwaves through the region. Panic erupted as the fishermen radioed for help, their voices crackling with desperation over the airwaves. The first images to reach the world were shaky, grainy phone videos. A massive bow looming, the moment of impact, shouts, splintering wood, and chaos at sea. The video cut out, but the message was clear. An unarmed civilian vessel had been attacked, and lives were now in jeopardy. This was no longer a local dispute. It was a flashpoint, threatening to draw in nations far beyond the region. The world saw a blatant violation of international law and a test of alliances as leaders scrambled to respond. The stakes for the region had never been higher, with military and diplomatic tensions rising by the hour. The incident was a direct challenge to the rules-based order that keeps the world's oceans safe and to the fragile peace that holds in these waters. The story was just beginning, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the South China Sea, affecting global trade, security, and diplomacy. The attack on the Maria Clara would force nations to take sides and test the resolve of international institutions. It was a moment that demanded action, not just words. The world's leaders faced a critical choice. The world's attention was now fixed on Manila and Beijing. Every move was scrutinized, every statement weighed. Would this be the spark that ignited a wider conflict, or a catalyst for urgent diplomacy? Or would it become a turning point for peace and order in the region? A chance to reaffirm the rules that keep the seas open and safe? The fate of the fishermen and the future of the South China Sea hung in the balance. Families waited, hoping for news, fearing the worst. The world waited for the next move. The crisis had begun, and its outcome would shape the course of history in the region and beyond. The attack was swift and brutal, catching everyone on board off guard and leaving little time to react. The Chinese Coast Guard ship 5305 rammed the Maria Clara with calculated force, its steel hull crashing into the fragile wooden boat. Captain Roberto Diaz tried desperately to evade, steering hard to port, but the wooden boat was no match for the massive patrol ship bearing down on them. The impact shattered the hull, water flooding in instantly, turning the deck into chaos as the crew scrambled to respond. Nets and equipment scattered across the deck as the crew struggled to stay afloat, grabbing life jackets and whatever supplies they could reach. Eyewitnesses said the Chinese ship circled for nearly an hour, using powerful water cannons to intimidate and disorient the fishermen before ramming. This was a message: these waters belong to us, and any challenge would be met with force. The Chinese crew offered no help, no life rafts, no aid, just cold indifference as the Maria Clara began to sink beneath the waves. The abandonment was as cruel as the attack itself, leaving the fishermen to cling to debris in the open sea, desperate and alone. The damage was catastrophic. The boat was lost, the men left to the mercy of the sea, their fate hanging in the balance. This was a clear escalation, no longer just posturing, but outright violence against unarmed civilians, shocking the region. The world could not look away. News of the attack spread rapidly, sparking outrage and concern across the globe. The Philippines and its allies faced a direct challenge, forced to confront a new level of aggression in disputed waters. The attack violated international law and basic decency, raising urgent questions about the safety of civilians at sea. The question now, how would Manila respond to this blatant act of aggression and disregard for human life? The line had been crossed. The world demanded answers, and calls for justice grew louder with each passing hour. The fate of the fishermen was uncertain. As the crisis deepened, hope and fear mingled on the open water. For the 12 men of the Maria Clara, terror set in as their boat began to sink beneath the waves, their world suddenly upended in the vast, unforgiving ocean. Water rose fast. Panic and confusion swept over them as survival became their only goal. They grabbed anything that floated, fuel drums, planks of wood, and scattered debris, desperately clinging to life. Captain Diaz, thinking quickly, kept his men together, tying them with ropes from their fishing nets so no one would drift away. They were miles from shore, with no way to call for help, the relentless sun beating down on their exposed faces. Hope faded as the day wore on, exhaustion and thirst setting in. They thought of their families, wondering if anyone knew what had happened, or if rescue would ever come. Night fell, bringing cold, fear, and a new kind of darkness that seemed endless. The men shivered, clinging to each other and to hope, their bodies aching from the cold and their spirits tested. Every distant light was a possible rescue, every shadow a threat lurking in the black water. They shouted for help, but the vast ocean swallowed their voices, leaving only silence in return. Their ordeal was a test of endurance, brotherhood, and the will to survive against impossible odds. The sea was vast and merciless, stretching endlessly in every direction, indifferent to their suffering. The cost of conflict was now painfully human, written on the faces of those who suffered most. Their survival depended on a miracle, a hope that, against all odds, someone would find them in the darkness. News of the attack hit Manila like a shockwave. The Philippine Coast Guard launched a search as outrage swept the nation. President Marcos Jr. condemned the attack, vowing justice and the safe return of the fishermen. The government filed a strong protest with China, demanding accountability and compensation. The incident was declared an attack on the nation's sovereignty. The military was placed on high alert. The Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States was activated. Manila formally requested U.S. assistance. The country united. Politicians, citizens, and the military stood together. Social media erupted with support for the fishermen and calls for action. The rescue operation intensified, with air and sea assets scouring the area. The world watched as the Philippines took a stand. The call for help set the stage for international intervention. The crisis had become a test of alliances. The American response was immediate. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet mobilized, sending the USS Ronald Reagan and its strike group toward the South China Sea. A P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft joined the search, coordinating with the Philippine Coast Guard. The P-8's sensors spotted the fishermen clinging to debris. Coordinates were relayed. The BRP Teresa Magbanua raced to the scene. Relief swept the command center. The fishermen were alive. U.S. intervention had made the difference. The arrival of the carrier group changed the regional dynamic. The message to China was clear. The U.S. stands by its allies. The Navy's presence enforced the rule of law. The South China Sea was not for any one nation to claim. The rescue was a victory for alliance and resolve. The crisis had drawn the world's attention. With the fishermen rescued, the mission shifted. The Philippines and the U.S. launched a joint patrol in the West Philippine Sea. This was no drill. It was a direct response to Chinese aggression. The USS Ronald Reagan and Philippine Navy frigates sailed in formation. Fighter jets from both nations patrolled the skies. The patrol passed through the site of the ramming, a deliberate show of unity. Chinese vessels kept their distance, unwilling to provoke a confrontation. The joint patrol created a protective shield for Filipino fishermen. It was more than a show of force. It was a living alliance in action. American and Filipino forces worked seamlessly together. The message, these waters are open and free, protected by law and alliance. The patrol set a new standard for regional security. The world took notice. The joint patrol's impact was immediate. Chinese harassment of Filipino fishermen stopped. The presence of Allied naval power deterred further aggression. Filipino boats returned to their traditional fishing grounds. Pride and relief swept the fishing communities. The alliance had delivered real security. The patrol reassured Southeast Asia unity works. The operation was strong but measured, meant to prevent conflict, not provoke it. The South China Sea was, for now, a safer place. The rules-based order had been defended. The world responded with swift condemnation of the attack. Japan, Australia, and European nations voiced support for the Philippines and called for respect for international law. The United Nations urged restraint and peaceful resolution. China found itself diplomatically isolated. The incident highlighted the dangers of unchecked maritime aggression. The Philippines' stand, backed by allies, was seen as just. Global support strengthened Manila's position. The crisis became a rallying point for defending the rules-based order. The world had drawn a line against coercion. The message: no nation stands alone. The crisis redefined security in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S.-Philippines alliance proved its strength and relevance. Trust and cooperation between Manila and Washington reached new heights. Japan deepened its security partnership with the Philippines. A trilateral framework with the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines began to take shape. The incident inspired greater unity among Southeast Asian nations. The joint patrol became a model for regional security. The message: collective action can counter aggression. The bravery of a few fishermen sparked a renewed commitment to peace. The shield of alliance had been tested, and it held.